On the 11th of May, 2012, a house fire on Victory Road in Derby, England, resulted in the deaths of 6 children from the same family: Duwayne, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, and Jayden Philpott. The incident initially appeared to be a tragic accident, but within days, the investigation shifted focus to the children's parents, Mick and Mairead Philpott. Police and fire investigators determined that the blaze had been deliberately started inside the home using petrol as an accelerant. The evidence pointed to a staged arson intended to frame another person in an ongoing custody dispute. Instead, the fire spread rapidly, trapping the children upstairs and causing fatal smoke inhalation. Following a high-profile trial in 2013, Mick and Mairead Philpott, along with their friend Paul Mosley, were convicted of manslaughter. The case drew national attention due to the unusual motive, the scale of the loss, and the extensive public history of the Philpott family prior to the fire. This episode examines the events leading up to the fire, the investigation that uncovered the truth, and the legal proceedings that followed. If you enjoyed these episodes, I encourage you to follow or subscribe to Criminal Interrupted on your favourite podcast app. As I've mentioned before, I'm currently focusing on this podcast full-time due to a heart condition, so every follow and review makes a huge difference. Thank you for listening and for your incredible support. This is Criminal Interrupted. Michael Mick Philpott was born in December 1956 into a working-class family in Derbyshire, England. Nothing in his early childhood stood out as unusual. To neighbours and relatives, he appeared to be a fairly typical boy, and by his late teens, he was even preparing for a career in the army. But beneath that ordinary exterior, there was already signs of a personality that was far more volatile and dangerous than anyone realised at the time. As people later tried to understand his behaviour, many pointed to what psychology refers to as the dark triad, a combination of psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism. Each of these traits can exist on its own without necessarily leading someone toward violence, but when all three are present together, they create a personality profile associated with manipulation, impulsivity, and a profound disregard for others. In Philpott's case, these traits seem to align almost perfectly with the man he eventually became. Psychopathy, at its core, involves a lack of empathy. Narcissism centers on an inflated sense of self-importance, and Machiavellianism reflects a willingness to manipulate, deceive, or exploit others to achieve personal goals. None of these traits are especially rare in isolation. Most people have encountered individuals who fit one or two of these categories, especially in competitive environments like business or politics. And importantly, having these traits doesn't automatically make someone dangerous. The problem arises when all three traits overlap. People who score highly across the dark triad are statistically more likely to engage in harmful behaviour, to act without considering consequences, and to prioritise their own desires above the well-being of anyone around them. For Mick Philpott, this combination manifested most clearly in his relationships with women. Those who knew him described him as controlling, domineering, and frequently violent. His partners were often isolated, intimidated, and subjected to escalating abuse. By the time he was 21 years old, that violence had already reached a near-fatal level. In the summer of 1978, Philpott's girlfriend, Kim Hill, told him she planned to leave him because of his manipulative and abusive behaviour. Her decision triggered an extreme and brutal response. On July 24th, Philpott broke into her home while she slept and stabbed her more than 27 times as she lay in bed. The attack left her with collapsed lungs and puncture wounds to her bladder, kidneys, and liver. Kim's mother, who was in the house at the time, heard the struggle and tried to intervene. Philpott turned on her as well, stabbing her 11 times. When paramedics arrived, they were confronted with 2 women who were critically injured and barely clinging to life. and even in that moment, Philpott showed no remorse. He reportedly told emergency responders, quote, "I wouldn't bother. She's a goner. I've done a good job on her," end quote. Despite the severity of their injuries, both women survived. Philpott was arrested and charged with attempted murder and grievous bodily harm. He received a sentence of 7.5 years in prison, a punishment many later viewed as shockingly lenient given the brutality of the attack. And this wasn't the first time he had assaulted Kim. Before the stabbing, he had shot her in the groin with a crossbow because he believed her dress was too short. On another occasion, he smashed her kneecap with a hammer because she was paying attention to the baby she was babysitting instead of him. Much of his violence stemmed from obsessive jealousy. Whenever he returned from military postings, he immediately accused her of cheating, and no amount of reassurance could convince him otherwise. His paranoia and possessiveness only intensified the abuse. These incidents weren't hidden from the people around them. In one particular public episode, Philpott struck Kim across the mouth with a pool cue in a crowded bar, splitting her lip open. No one intervened. Locals knew Philpott's reputation. He was volatile, aggressive, and quick to retaliate. People feared him, and that fear allowed his violence to continue unchecked. Even after he was imprisoned for the stabbing, Philpott showed no understanding of the harm he had caused. He wrote letters to Kim from behind bars, outlining his plans for their future and insisting they would marry once he was released. Kim, of course, had no intention of ever seeing him again. She was relieved he was locked away, but the justice system had other ideas. Despite the severity of his crimes, Philpott served only 3 years and 2 months of his sentence before being released. Officials deemed him no longer a danger to the community, a decision that, in hindsight, proved tragically misguided. The assumption seemed to be that someone who had stabbed 2 women a combined 38 times had somehow learned his lesson. After his release from prison, Mick Philpott entered a new chapter of his life, one that, on the surface, looked calmer but quickly revealed the same patterns of control and abuse that defined his earlier relationships. In 1986, he married a woman named Pamela Lomax. For a brief period, their relationship appeared stable enough that they went on to have 3 children together. But as with many abusive dynamics, the early harmony didn't last. Slowly, the version of Mick that Pamela first met gave way to the real one, a man who demanded control, obedience, and constant attention. Before long, Pamela was confiding in others about his behavior. She described him as increasingly controlling, unpredictable, and difficult to live with. The situation deteriorated to the point where she began hoping he would leave her for someone else, a desperate wish that, in her case, would soon come true. Mick eventually met a teenager named Heather Kehoe and became infatuated with her. The most immediate issue, aside from the fact that he was still married, was the age gap. Heather was 16 years old, while Mick was 37 years old. Although 16 is the age of consent in the UK, which doesn't excuse this at all, reports later suggested that the two had actually met when Heather was only 14. And in many ways, the age difference fit a pattern. Younger partners were easier for Mick to manipulate, easier to isolate, and easier to control. Heather soon found herself swept into his world. The pair ran away together, and it didn't take long for the relationship to turn violent. The first major shift came when Heather failed to give Mick what he wanted most, a daughter. Despite the fact that they had 2 sons together, and despite Mick having already multiple children from previous relationships, he fixated on the idea that Heather owed him a girl. When that didn't happen, he responded with escalating violence. Heather later described being beaten and sexually abused, punished for something she had no control over. Even more disturbing was the way that Mick involved their children in the abuse. He taught their 2 younger sons to hit their mother if they felt that she was out of line, normalizing violence in the household and reinforcing his dominance. For Heather, the situation became unbearable. She tried to convince her children to see their father for who he truly was, but they were too young and too deeply influenced by him to understand. Eventually, she was forced to flee the home without them. The fight to regain custody was long, expensive, and emotionally draining, but Heather ultimately won full custody and began the difficult process of undoing the psychological damage Mick had inflicted on their children. Even after she escaped physically, Mick continued to torment her from afar. For years, he spread allegations about her within their social circles, attempting to damage her reputation and isolate her socially, a tactic common among abusers who lose control of their victims. By the time Heather was finally free of him, Mick had already moved on to new targets. When he didn't have a romantic partner available to dominate, he simply redirected his aggression elsewhere. In 1991, he headbutted a co-worker during an argument and received a 2-year conditional discharge. It was yet another example of his inability to regulate his anger or accept any challenge to his authority. Given his history, it's difficult to imagine why anyone would willingly enter a relationship with him, but abusers often have a talent for identifying people who are vulnerable, isolated, and already accustomed to unhealthy dynamics. That's exactly what happened in 2000, when Mick met 19-year-old single mother Mairead Duffy. Mairead had endured a deeply traumatic upbringing. She reported being abused as a child, bullied throughout school, and raped as a teenager. By 16, she had become a single mother after her boyfriend abandoned her during her pregnancy, leaving her vulnerable, isolated, and desperate for stability. When she met Mick, she had just left another volatile relationship and was still emotionally raw, making her an easy target for someone with his manipulative tendencies. Instead of recognizing the danger, Mairead quickly became attached to him. She referred to Mick as her guardian angel, a phrase that reflected both her longing for protection and his ability to present himself as a savior when it suited him. Before long, she and her young son moved into Mick's home in Derby, becoming part of his increasingly chaotic household. But even Mairead, who idolized him, struggled with his behavior. Only a year into their relationship, Mick began seeing another woman, a 16-year-old single mother named Lisa Willis. Lisa had grown up in the care system and had no parental figures in her life. For someone with that background, an older man who offered her attention, stability, and a sense of belonging could easily appear comforting, even if the reality was far more sinister. Whatever the dynamic between Mick and Lisa was, he made no effort to hide it from Mairead. He openly maintained relationships with both women, and by 2002, Lisa had moved into the home Mick shared with Mairead. The house, located at 18 Victory Road in Allington, Derby, became the centre of a highly unusual and deeply imbalanced domestic arrangement. The hypocrisy of the situation was glaring. Mick had previously beaten partners nearly to death over suspected infidelity, yet he expected complete acceptance of his own behaviour. But in Mick's mind, his desires were the only ones that mattered. If Mairead had a problem with it, that was her issue, and she knew the consequences of challenging him. Speaking up risked violence, humiliation, or worse, so she stayed silent. This silence allowed the household to evolve into a polyamorous arrangement, though the term hardly fits the reality. True polyamory requires consent, equality, and autonomy, none of which existed here. Instead, the dynamic was shaped entirely by Mick's control. Both women were significantly younger than him, both were financially dependent on him, and neither was allowed to pursue relationships of their own. The power imbalance was unmistakable. Despite this, there were moments that suggested the women were trying to make the best of their situation. When Mick and Mairead married in May 2003, Lisa served as a bridesmaid. Whether this reflected genuine acceptance or simply resignation is impossible to know, but it underscored how deeply Mick's influence permeated the household. Behind closed doors, the abuse continued. When Mick became convinced, without evidence, that Lisa's brother-in-law was the father of her child, he beat her repeatedly in an attempt to force a confession. There was nothing to confess, but that didn't matter. Mick demanded control, and when that reality didn't align with his beliefs, he used violence to try and bend it to his will. Mairead witnessed these assaults, but felt powerless to intervene. She knew that speaking up could make her the next target. This atmosphere of fear extended to the children as well. Between them, Mick, Mairead and Lisa had 11 children living under the same roof. Mick had fathered 9 of them, 5 with Mairead and 4 with Lisa, and he had 5 additional children from earlier relationships, though he had no contact with those. Despite the size of the household, Mick took little interest in the children's needs. He didn't help with feeding them, clothing them, or getting them to school. In his view, childcare was women's work, and he expected the 2 women to manage everything while he remained the unquestioned head of the household. What Mick did care about, however, was the financial benefit of having a large family. He saw his children not as individuals, but as a source of income. Despite both women working, Mick claimed as many government benefits as he could, all while refusing to work himself. The household became a carefully constructed system in which Mick maintained control, avoided responsibility, and exploited the people around him for financial gain. Inside the Philpott household, control wasn't just emotional or physical, it was financial. Every penny that entered the home, whether it came from state benefits or from the wages earned by the women living there, went directly into Mick's bank account. No one else had access. If anyone needed food, clothes, school supplies, or even basic household items, they had to ask him. This financial chokehold gave him near total authority over the household, and he wielded it with the same entitlement he applied to every other part of his life, and he had plenty of money to control. Through a combination of welfare payments and the income earned by his partners, Mick's annual household income exceeded £60,000. For a man who refused to work, it was a staggering amount of money, and once the public learned about it, the outrage was immediate. By 2006, Mick Philpott had become a tabloid fixture in the UK. Newspapers ran stories criticising him for requesting that the local council move his entire family into a larger, taxpayer-funded home. The idea that someone who contributed nothing financially could demand a bigger house while fathering child after child struck a nerve with the public. And when journalists rediscovered his 1978 conviction for attempted murder, the backlash intensified. People began openly questioning whether he was fit to raise children at all. To many, Mick was the embodiment of a sociopath, manipulative, self-serving, and incapable of understanding the consequences of his actions. But in the mid-2000s, British daytime television had a place for people like him, and that place was The Jeremy Kyle Show. The program, known for its confrontational style and sensational topics, was the UK's answer to American talk shows like The Jerry Springer Show. And in the spring of 2007, Mick appeared on an episode titled Father to 15, Wife and Girlfriend Pregnant Again. He went on the show hoping to justify why he deserved a larger council house. Instead, he made things worse. Throughout the episode, he bragged about how much money he received in benefits, boasted about his complicated family structure, and even discussed his desire to divorce his wife so he could marry his girlfriend. He offered no explanation for why he refused to work, nor why taxpayers should fund his lifestyle. The audience was unimpressed, and the media reaction was brutal. But Mick didn't see it that way. In his mind, the appearance made him a celebrity. The attention fed his narcissism, and he began looking for ways to monetize his newfound notoriety. At one point, he even planned to get a vasectomy and sell the rights to film the procedure to the highest bidder. As he allegedly put it, Mick Philpott's seed is too good to waste. He refused to undergo the operation unless he could profit from it. When he wasn't trying to sell footage of his vasectomy, he was making the rounds on the tabloid circuit, giving interviews, posing for photos, and appearing on more television programs. One of the most notable was Anne Widdecombe Versus, an ITV documentary series hosted by the former Conservative MP Anne Widdecombe. The show paired Widdecombe with individuals who relied heavily on the benefit system, and Mick was a perfect candidate. But unlike Jeremy Kyle, Widdecombe wasn't a shock jock entertainer. She was a seasoned politician who understood the welfare system inside and out, and she had little patience for Mick's excuses. During her stay in the Philpott household, she confronted him repeatedly about his refusal to work and his lack of involvement in his children's lives. She even found 3 employers willing to hire him. One company, a barrel-making business, offered him a job outright based on her recommendation. Mick didn't show up for his first day. The tension between them escalated until Mick snapped, calling Widdicombe an interfering bitch who had no right to involve herself in his affairs. It was a familiar pattern, the same language he used towards his wife and his mistress whenever they displeased him. By this point, Mick had reduced both Mairead and Lisa to little more than objects in his mind. He spent much of his time living in a caravan outside the house, inviting whichever partner he wanted to sleep with on any given night. The women were expected to comply without question, and when they didn't, the consequences were violent. In 2010, police issued Mick a formal caution after he dragged Mairead out of the house by her hair and slapped her during an argument. The following year, Mairead became pregnant by another man during a dogging session, which is a group sex encounter that Mick himself had arranged. Unable to tolerate the idea of a man fathering a child with her, he forced her to have an abortion. His violence wasn't limited to the women in his life. In November 2011, he punched another driver during a road rage incident. He was convicted of common assault and released on bail while awaiting sentencing. His behaviour was spiralling, and those around him could see it, but the worst was still to come. In February 2002, everything changed. After years of abuse, manipulation, and control, Lisa finally reached her breaking point. She fled the house with her children, leaving Mick behind. For most people, this would be the end of a toxic relationship. But for Mick and many other abusers, it was something far more threatening, a loss of control. Lisa's departure shattered the dynamic he had spent years constructing. She had been under his thumb for so long that the idea of her making independent decisions, especially decisions that involved taking his children away, was intolerable to him. He first tried to coax her back with sweet talk. When that failed, he turned to threats, warning her of violence if she didn't come to her senses. But Lisa refused to return. She knew the environment was damaging not only to her, but to her children, and for the first time, she chose their safety over Mick's demands. For Mick, this was unacceptable. He couldn't accept defeat, couldn't accept that someone he believed he owned had walked away, and so he began to devise a plan, one that would become one of the most shocking and catastrophic criminal schemes in modern British history. His idea was rooted in revenge, control, and a complete detachment from reality. He confided in Mairead that he had a plan to solve the situation with Lisa once and for all. In his mind, the solution was simple: force a custody hearing, then set a fire in the house and blame Lisa for starting it. If authorities believed she had tried to harm the children, she would lose custody and be forced to return to Mick if she ever wanted to see them again. The plan was absurd on its face. It required Lisa to willingly re-enter a home she had fled in fear. It required the authorities to believe she had a motive that she didn't have. And it required Mick and Mairead to be clever enough to stage a fire convincingly, something neither of them had the intelligence or foresight to pull off. But Mick wasn't thinking logically. He was thinking like a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. He pushed Mairead to agree to the plan, and she eventually did, not because she believed it would work, but because she feared losing him. Even at this stage, she was so emotionally entangled, so conditioned by years of abuse, that she was willing to risk her children's lives to keep him happy. With Mairead reluctantly on board, Mick brought in a third participant, his best friend, Paul Mosley. Together they began laying the groundwork. They spread rumours among friends and acquaintances that Lisa had been making threats against them. When Lisa heard about the lies and called Mick in anger, he recorded the calls and took them to the authorities as evidence of her instability. It worked. A custody meeting was scheduled for May 11, 2012. And with that date set, Mick believed the stage was perfectly prepared for the next phase of his plan, a fire that would change everything. With the custody hearing scheduled and their plan fully formed, the evening of May 10, 2012, the night before the meeting, became the moment Mick Philpott, Mairead Philpott, and their friend Paul Mosley set the final stage for what they believed would be a flawless setup. Their goal was simple in Mick's mind: create a fire, blame Lisa Willis, and use the chaos to regain control of the children she had taken with her when she fled the household. But the reality of what they were about to do was far more catastrophic than any of them seemed capable of understanding. That night, after putting their 6 children, Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, Jayden, and Duwayne, to bed, Mick and Mairead invited Paul back into the house. The three adults began drinking heavily, a ritual that had become disturbingly normal in the Philpott household. At some point after midnight, the trio engaged in a threesome, a detail that would later horrify the public not only because of its timing, but because of the cold detachment it revealed about their state of mind in the hours leading up to the fire. By around 3 a.m. on the morning of May 11th, the tone shifted. The drinking and sexual escapism gave way to the grim task ahead. Mick and Mairead began pouring petrol across the floor of the house, focusing heavily on the hallway at the bottom of the stairs, the only escape route for the children sleeping on the second floor. Paul, aware enough to try to remove evidence, took the petrol containers away from the property once the pouring was complete. At approximately 3:30 a.m., Mick ignited the fire. The flames spread with terrifying speed. Because the fire's epicenter was at the staircase, the children upstairs had no possible route to safety. Within minutes, the house was filled with thick, toxic smoke. The reality of what they had done, and the danger their children were now in, began to dawn on the three adults. They fled the house and ran into a neighbour's garden, where Mairead called emergency services, crying and begging for help. She told the operator that a fire had started while they were asleep, and that although she and Mick had managed to escape, the children were trapped upstairs. Even in that moment, Mick stuck to the script. As neighbours emerged from their homes, woken by the blaze, he immediately began telling them that he believed Lisa Willis had started the fire. But what stood out most to those present wasn't his accusation, it was his complete lack of emotion. While Mairead appeared panicked, Mick seemed detached, almost rehearsed. James Butler, one of the neighbours who witnessed the scene, later described Mick's behaviour. Quote, "There was no emotion. If he would have grabbed hold of me and said, 'Please, come on, let's get in there, my kids are in there,' I know that would have been a true man as a father." End quote. But Mick didn't do that. He didn't attempt to re-enter the house. He didn't plead for help. He simply stood outside, repeating his claim that Lisa was responsible. By the time firefighters arrived, the situation was already dire. The smoke was so dense and the flames so intense that even accessing the second-floor windows with ladders proved impossible. Still, the fire crews worked relentlessly to reach the children. In what would later be described as a small miracle, they managed to pull 13-year-old Duwayne from the house alive, though he was critically injured. The other 5 children, aged between 5 and 10, were not as fortunate. They unfortunately died at the scene from smoke inhalation. 2 days later, despite the efforts of the medical staff, Duwayne also passed away in hospital. His injuries were simply too severe. The community was devastated. A memorial service was held in the days that followed, and the nation mourned the loss of 6 young lives. On May 16th, Mick and Mairead held a press conference, continuing to insist that they had nothing to do with the fire. Despite Mick's reputation, many people initially believed them. The idea that parents could deliberately start a fire that killed their own children seemed unthinkable. A fund was set up to help pay for the funerals, raising over £11,000. The funerals were scheduled for June 22nd, but by the time the day arrived, neither Mick nor Mairead would be there. They were already in custody. It didn't take long for investigators to notice that something about the Philpotts' behaviour didn't add up. The circumstances of the fire were suspicious from the start, but Mick's emotional detachment raised even more questions. After the children's bodies were taken to the mortuary, the parents were asked to identify them, a moment that would break most people, but Mick showed no visible distress. Now, grief does manifest differently for everyone, and investigators knew that, but when combined with everything else, including Mick's behaviour at the hospital, the picture became increasingly troubling. While Duwayne lay on life support, Mick repeatedly left his bedside to have food fights with Mairead or flirt with other women. Nurses and staff were stunned. It didn't align with the behaviour of a grieving father. Then there was the press conference. Body language experts who reviewed the footage noted several red flags. Dr. Cliff Lansley, one such expert, pointed out inconsistencies in their emotional displays and their verbal responses. Something felt off. Meanwhile, Lisa Willis, who had initially been arrested after petrol residue was found at the scene, was beginning to look less and less like a suspect. The investigation was shifting. The more detectives learned, the more they suspected the fire had been an inside job. Public opinion began to shift as well. Stories emerged that much of the funeral fund money had been spent by Mick and Mairead on shopping sprees and high-end clothing. The community that had rallied around them now felt betrayed. With suspicions mounting, police made a strategic decision. They bugged the hotel room where Mick and Mairead were staying. It didn't take long for the recordings to pay off. Within days, Mick was heard telling Mairead to stick to their story. It wasn't a confession, but it was enough to show they were hiding something. On May 28th, after Lisa was released without charges, Mick and Mairead were arrested on suspicion of murder. 2 days later, following further questioning and the discovery of additional evidence, including petrol containers and discarded clothing belonging to Mick, Mairead, and Paul Mosley, the couple were formally charged with causing the deaths of their children. On November 5th, Paul Mosley was also charged with murder, though his charge was later downgraded to manslaughter. The Philpotts' charges were downgraded as well. Prosecutors concluded that while the trio had clearly started the fire, there was no evidence they intended to kill the children. Their goal had been to frame Lisa, not to cause fatalities. But intent didn't change the outcome. 6 children were dead. Whether the charge was murder or manslaughter, the consequences were devastating. Mairead's initial claim that she had only gone along with the plan out of fear quickly fell apart. Evidence showed she had participated willingly, and her behaviour after the fire, including her lack of visible grief and a focus on the funeral money, painted a damning picture. Forensic psychologist Dr. Kerry Nixon later commented on Mairead's emotional detachment, noting that her priorities seemed disturbingly misaligned with the gravity of what just happened, and the jury agreed. On April 2, 2013, the long and emotionally charged trial of Mick Philpott, Mairead Philpott, and Paul Mosley reached its conclusion at Nottingham Crown Court. After weeks of testimony, forensic evidence, and witness accounts, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict. All 3 were found guilty of manslaughter. Given the overwhelming evidence presented by the prosecution, there was little room for any other outcome. The judge presiding over the case made it clear that what the trio had orchestrated was nothing short of catastrophic. Although all 3 bore responsibility, the judge reserved particular condemnation for Mick Philpott. His long history of violence, manipulation, and domination over others was central to understanding both his character and the danger he posed to the public. Addressing Mick directly, the judge said, quote, "Witness after witness described the dynamics in your household. You were the kingpin, no one else mattered." End quote. Mick had attempted to argue that the deaths of his children were accidental, an unintended consequence of a plan that had spiraled out of control, but the judge rejected that argument outright. He explained that while Mick may have not intended to kill his children, he had certainly intended to terrorize them. Quote, "What you did intend, plainly, was to subject your children to a terrifying ordeal. They were to be awoken from their beds in the middle of the night with their home on fire so you could rescue them and be the hero. Their terror was the price they were going to pay for your callous selfishness." End quote. There was no sympathy in the courtroom for Mick Philpott, and it wasn't just the judge who felt that way. As Mick was led from the dock, members of the public gallery, many of them local residents who had followed the case closely, shouted at him, quote, "Die, Mick, die." End quote. The only question that remained was what sentences the 3 would receive. Given Mick's role as the architect of the plan, many wondered whether he would face a harsher punishment than the others. On April 3, 2013, sentencing was handed down. Mick Philpott received a life sentence, with a minimum of 15 years to be served before he could be considered for parole. Mairead Philpott and Paul Mosley, whose roles were deemed slightly less central, were each sentenced to 17 years, with eligibility for release after serving half of their terms. Despite the verdict, Mairead continued to insist she had acted under duress. She claimed she had only participated because she feared the consequences of refusing Mick. Later that year, on November 29th, she appealed her conviction, but that appeal was swiftly dismissed. The court found no compelling evidence that she had been coerced. With all 3 perpetrators behind bars, the national conversation shifted. The Philpott case ignited a fierce debate across the UK about welfare dependency, family benefits, and the responsibilities of the state. High-profile politicians, including Chancellor George Osborne, weighed in. arguing that the welfare system should not be supporting families like the Philpotts, but the discussion quickly devolved into something far more toxic. Conservative media outlets seized on the case as an opportunity to attack the welfare state more broadly, painting the entire working class with the same brush. What could have been a nuanced conversation about social policy became a partisan battleground. Accusations flew from both sides, and any meaningful dialogue was drowned out by political mudslinging. Mick Philpott, however, had no issue with the attention. Even from behind bars, he relished being at the centre of a national controversy. Approaching his 60s and facing the likelihood of spending the rest of his life in prison, he still believed he was the victim. He began campaigning for his release, writing letters to supporters and pen pals insisting he'd been wronged. In one such letter he wrote, quote, "I will be out one day. They can't keep me in forever," end quote. It was a classic display of his narcissism, an inability to accept responsibility for his actions, and a delusional belief that he could somehow talk his way out of a life sentence. But if Mick truly believed he would walk free any time soon, he was mistaken. Not only was there no chance of his sentence being reduced, but more trouble was on the horizon. Shortly after he began serving his sentence, police interviewed him regarding allegations of rape. During the arson investigation, several witnesses had come forward with information suggesting Mick had committed multiple sexual assaults over the years, including one incident dating back to 1996. Despite the disturbing nature of the allegations, and despite Mick's history making them tragically plausible, there was insufficient evidence to bring charges. The case was eventually dropped. Even in prison, Mick managed to manipulate the system to his advantage. He received new dental work, paid by UK taxpayers, a detail that infuriated many who felt he had already taken far too much from the public purse. As for the other two perpetrators, their futures unfolded differently. In November 2020, after serving just 8 years of her sentence, Mairead Philpott was released on licence for good behaviour. Her release sparked outrage. Many believed she should have served her full term, given the severity of the crime. David Spence, Research Director for the Centre of Crime Prevention, expressed what many felt. Quote, "The system of automatically releasing criminals like her halfway through their sentence means that in cases like this, justice has not been done. This needs to change." End quote. Even Mairead's own mother publicly stated that her daughter should have remained in prison longer, but the law allowed her release, and there was nothing the public could do to reverse it. What they could do, however, was fight to prevent her from returning to the community where the fire had taken place. Residents were adamant that they did not feel safe with her nearby. Their concerns were taken seriously enough that the local Conservative MP for Mid-Derbyshire issued a public statement condemning the early release as, quote, "a disgrace to the memories of the children who died," end quote, and vowed to do everything in her power to keep Mairead from returning to Derby. 1 year later, in May 2021, Paul Mosley was also released from prison. But unlike Mairead, his freedom was short-lived. Just 2 months later, on July 10th, he violated the terms of his parole and was promptly sent back to prison. Even now, years after the fire, the impact of Mick Philpott's crimes continues to ripple outward. The local community still carries the emotional scars of that night, and the earlier victims of Mick's violence, long overshadowed by the tragedy of the fire, continue to live with the consequences of what he did to them. Kim Hill, Mick's first known victim, suffered lifelong physical and emotional trauma from his attack. One of the stab wounds he inflicted caused a prolapsed womb, forcing her to undergo a hysterectomy. She would never be able to have children of her own, a devastating loss that shaped the rest of her life. Her mother, Shirley, who was stabbed 11 times during the same attack, later developed terminal liver cancer. She believed the scarring from Mick's assault contributed to her illness. Before her death, she referred to herself as Mick's final victim, a haunting reminder that his violence left a trail of destruction far beyond the 6 children who died in the fire. In the years following his conviction, Mick Philpott remained a high-profile inmate within the UK prison system, and his notoriety made him a frequent target for hostility from other prisoners. According to confirmed reports, Philpott was attacked inside HMP Wakefield, the high-security prison where he is serving his sentence. He was ambushed by another inmate and left with visible injuries, including bruising and a wound to the back of his head. Prison sources described the assault as sudden and unprovoked, noting that Philpott's crimes, particularly the deaths of 6 children, placed him at a heightened risk within the prison hierarchy. Following the incident, Philpott received medical treatment and was placed under additional monitoring for his own safety. The attack did not result in any change to his sentence or legal status, but it reinforced what prison staff had acknowledged for years. Philpott carries a target on his back due to the nature of his offences. No further details about the attacker or disciplinary outcomes were released publicly. In the end, the story of Mick Philpott is not just the story of one man's violence, manipulation, and lifelong patterns of abuse. It's the story of the people who lived in his shadow, the partners he controlled, the communities he unsettled, and the children whose lives were cut short by a plan so reckless and self-serving that it defies comprehension. 6 young lives were lost in a fire that should have never been set, and countless others were scarred long before that night ever happened. For all the headlines, the political debates, and the media frenzy that followed, the core truth of this case remains painfully simple. The victims were children who deserved safety, stability, and a chance to grow up. They were Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, Jayden, and Duwayne. Siblings who went to their bed in their own home and never woke up again. Their names should be remembered long after their fathers' fades. And beyond them are the survivors of Mick Philpott's earlier violence. Women like Kim Hill and her mother Shirley, whose lives were permanently altered by his brutality. As we close this episode, we honour the victims, acknowledge the survivors, and remember the lessons this case leaves behind. Because the only way to prevent tragedies like this is to keep talking about them. Openly, honestly, and with the compassion the victims were always owed. Thank you for listening.